This morning we're going to start with Deuteronomy 30, and we are working our way through the covenant renewal liturgy that Israel goes through just as she's about to cross the River Jordan into the Promised Land. Now you remember last week I mentioned that Deuteronomy has in view a really important event. It's the Babylonian exile, which occurs in 586 BC. And that kind of event looms large here. And I want to say a word about that before moving on. One of these days in the near future, we're going to have a large Sunday school class where we can shut the doors. We're going to start the capital campaign in a few minutes. So one of the things that's in view here, right, is that the relationship between God and his people is going to be a relationship of constant covenant breaking. Anyone who's read any of the Old Testament knows that that's the case. So Deuteronomy 30 is attempting to put that relationship in a kind of theological context. So what does that look like? What does it look like to think about God choosing a people who then are like repeatedly unfaithful to him? And by the way, right, these are the people that are supposedly sort of like the starting point of a new creation. Okay? So to use an analogy, Israel is intended to be sort of like humankind's lifeboat. But what happens when it's discovered that the lifeboat has several holes in it and can't really serve as a lifeboat? That's the question. That question is not definitively answered in Deuteronomy, but we do get the beginnings of the answer, and the answer is something like this. Israel certainly is going to have many moments of failure in her life. She will constantly break the covenant. She will constantly be unfaithful. But that unfaithfulness is not going to be allowed to overrule God's purposes. So one way that we get a sense of this is, I'm going to read to you the first part of Deuteronomy 30, and then we'll take a look at one way to kind of put this in a context. This is Moses continuing talking about all the problems that are going to come upon Israel if she's disobedient. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse that which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with your heart and with your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and will have mercy on you, and he will gather you from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land of that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. So on one hand, right, we have this language about this exile. And that's, remember what I said last week, that's what happens in the Babylonian exile. The majority of the population of Judea is removed and spread out across the Babylonian Empire. This is what Jews refer to as the diaspora. So from that point on, from 586 BC, there will be more Jews living outside of Palestine than there will be living in it. That'll be the reality forever and ever until this day. But is that the end of the story? Well, no, because there's more to it than that. Covenant means that God is going to refuse to allow his people's unfaithfulness and disobedience to demolish his plan. And as I said, we're given some indications of what how that's going to happen in the Old Testament. Let me read to you part of a vision. This is from Isaiah 62. This is about Israel's future. And importantly, right, this is the vision that's given immediately after the exile. So it's 586 BC or thereabouts. Jerusalem is in ruins, the temple's been destroyed, the whole land's basically a wasteland. All Israel's political figures, intellectuals have been exiled into Babylon. There's chaos and destruction everywhere. And this is what Isaiah says about the future of Israel. Listen very carefully. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not be quiet, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch. The nations shall see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give you. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no longer be termed forsaken, and here this is capitalized because that's Israel's name, forsaken. And your land will no longer be termed desolate. Once again, that's a name. But you will be called, my delight is in her. This is going to be Israel's new name. My delight is in her. That's a name. Imagine, filling out a college application. Name, my delight is in her. So this is going to be Israel's new name. And your land, the new name of the land is going to be married. Capital M. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. Now, that's a vision, and there's a lot that's unsaid, but I want to emphasize two things about it. First, notice what happens. Somehow, Israel is going to be transformed from this sort of like unfaithful, desolate, rebellious people into, and here's the important image, into a people who are fit to be married to God. That's a radical transformation, right? One imagines, right, that transformation can only happen as a result of an action of God, and that's true, right? Second thing, remember in the Gospel of John where Jesus performs his first miracle? At a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Now that's not just happenstance, right? Jesus' first miracle takes place at a wedding because, in effect, it's Jesus' way of saying, way back when in Isaiah 62, when God talked about transforming the people of Israel so they were a fit person to be married to God, that's what I've come to do. The wedding's going to start here shortly because I'm going to bring it about. So we want to kind of hold on to that. The other theme here that's at work here, and it's a very important theme, and I wish we had more time to talk about it, but we don't. The other thing that's really important here is the theme of hope. Let me just say a brief word about that. I think that one of the problems that we have in like our world is we tend to think about hope, right, as a sort of almost like a subjective wish or expectation. As in, I hope that the trees in Tallahassee start getting golden and brown leaves. I hope that a cold front comes through and the temperature drops into the 80s. that kind of stuff. That is, hope is kind of like a subjective wish, right? It's really important to remember here that that's not what hope means here. Hope here, in the Old Testament and also in the New, hope here is not a subjective wish. It's not like about something that you and I kind of like want. Rather, hope is built on what God has promised, right? That means it's objective, okay? Hope is built on something that's objective. It's built on a promise from God. And the way that it works is this, right? If God says that his people are going to be radically transformed so they're a fit subject to be married to him, that means that his people need to live with that expectation. Okay? So that's part of what hope is about. Now, another thing that's really important that's going on here is, and we want to notice this. Notice this language. Notice the language that Deuteronomy uses about following the law. It talks here about turning to God with your heart, about turning to God with your soul. So, two things here that we want to just kind of think about. In the Old Testament, we don't have the division that we have in our world between the mind and the heart. That's a kind of a distinction that we've inherited in Western culture. In the Old Testament, the center of the person is the heart. That's where both thought and feelings take place. And actually, the word that the Old Testament usually uses for the word heart is actually what we would probably, the English equivalent would be something like kidneys. Okay? I want you to turn to the Lord your God with all your kidneys. Now, because that doesn't make sense to most English speakers, English translations tend to shift that to heart, which does make sense, okay? It's, you can imagine a sermon, like, someone's really getting excited, and the preacher, says, and if this congregation simply would turn to the Lord your God with all your kidneys, things would be fine. And that's when someone says, well, I could probably do that if you'd like shorten your sermon. But anyway, the thing we want to notice is this. It's really important that the vision of Deuteronomy here is not just simply that of a people who are like keeping some rules or regulations, but rather the vision of Deuteronomy is a people who are turned to the Lord their God with all their heart and with all their soul, or with the very center of who they are. Okay? And the difference between those two things is something like this. On one hand, right, you could imagine a people who were like obedient, to the law, but who kind of did it in a kind of like a forced way, right? Okay, I don't want to do this, but the law says we have to. So here we go. Now that's a kind of obedience, right? But not a real obedience, right? I don't know if you've ever, had this experience where maybe you're talking to a coworker who's like a subordinate, and you're kind of trying to direct them, and they look at you and say, whatever. That means, right, I'm going to do what you say, but I either A, disagree with you, or I don't think this needs to be done. Okay, so we don't want that. Rather, what Deuteronomy here is aiming for is a people for whom the service of God is like a joy. That's what Deuteronomy is aiming after. And that's what it means to turn to the Lord your God with your heart and also with your soul. Now, moving a little bit later on, we get a little bit more of this language. This is in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. And here we get another really important image, which I want to say something about. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and that you may live. Notice this really important idea, right? The Lord your God is going to circumcise your heart. Paul's going to talk about this passage later on, and he's going to make this really fundamental point, right? That what's being envisioned here is a covenant that's not simply a matter of objective regulations like the Ten Commandments on the tablets of stone, but rather a covenant written on the human heart, a covenant implanted in the human heart. So two things about that, because as I said, this is a really important idea. The idea resurfaces in the New Testament in a couple points. I just want to point out one. It comes in Colossians 2:11. I'll just read it to you, and I'll just a brief thing about it. This is Colossians actually 2, 9, 10, and 11 for the whole context. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells. The him here is Christ. And you have been filled with him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision not made without hands, by putting off the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ. Notice that this idea now kind of finds its way into the New Testament, right? And so we're looking at this reality, right, of a covenant which is somehow deeply implanted in the center of each person, so that it becomes sort of like their defining reality. So that's a really important idea. This is really an important thing because of what we're going to talk about next in terms of what happens in Deuteronomy 30, verse 11. So once again, one more look into the future, and then we'll go back. So in Jeremiah 31, there's a really important passage that I want to read to you. It too is about the covenant. It's Jeremiah 31 and following. So Jeremiah 31, and then the following verses. So this is looking forward now to that new covenant, and we're getting a description of what it's going to look like. And here it is. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke. Though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Now, this is another hint about how that transformation is going to occur, right? How we're going to move from a sinful, disobedient people to a people who have like this radical love of God. It's connected here with the new covenant. And the idea here, right, is that God's going to write his law on the hearts of the people. Now, a lot more could be said about that. I just want to say one thing, and then we're going to move on. It's really important to kind of notice how Old and New Testament ties together, because the writers of the New Testament certainly think that what they wrote tied together with the Old Testament, so we kind of need to see that as well. So just one really important fact, right? It's really important to remember that the day of Pentecost, that day in Acts 2, remember when the Holy Spirit descends upon the church? It's really important to remember that in Jesus' day, the Feast of Pentecost celebrated the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Law on Mount Sinai, new law of the new covenant, the Holy Spirit, where the covenant really is written on the hearts of people through the work of God. So all that's ahead, but we're gonna move on from there. One final thing. Moses has several times refers to the book of the law. Some people believe that this is actually, he's referring to Deuteronomy. He's certainly referring to the fact that at some point, somehow, some way, Israel had a book in which the whole of Torah was all collected and written. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it was read on a regular basis in the hearing of the people. Now, let's take a quick look at Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 14 or so. This is probably as far as we're going to get. For this commandment that I command you today, there's the law, is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it back to us that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it. Now, what God says here seems to be in some tension with something that Paul says in Romans 7, where Paul seems to be talking about that somehow like the law can't be kept by sinful human beings. So we have to kind of find a way of kind of putting these two statements together and seeing what they're talking about. I think we can say this about Deuteronomy 30:11 through 14. One, I think we can say that the passage here is intending to indicate that God does intend for the law to be kept. And that it's not simply sort of being like foisted on Israel as something that's going to like doom them to failure, right? The giving of the law here is not, I'm trying to think about an analogy. The giving of the law here is not, a situation where, a teacher in a 6th grade English class assigns the students in the class to read Dante's Divine Comedy in the original Italian and then berates them for not knowing Italian, right? What, you don't know Italian? I studied Italian when I was in the 2nd grade. It's not that. The law is being given. It is God's intention that the people keep it. But the keeping of the law presupposes some things. It presupposes that the people are going to be turned to the Lord. That's one thing. It also presupposes the nearness of God. So it presupposes those two things. If Israel's heart is turned away from God, then obviously the keeping the law is going to be impossible, right? If for no other reason, if your heart's turned away from God, right, you don't really want to keep it. And that's the point, right? So I think what Paul's saying in Romans 7 is a statement about our current condition. As sinners, right, our hearts are turned away from God, and there's a profound sense in which we're not obedient because we don't want to be. Okay? That's the problem. The problem is not that we need to have things made clearer to us. Oh, if it had been made clear to me that I wasn't supposed to lie, I wouldn't lie. Or something like that, right? What Paul, I think, is trying to say in a rather profound way is that, in effect, right, the keeping of the law, the keeping of God's expectations, which Jesus summarizes, right, as you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? That presupposes a heart and a soul turned toward God. And that presupposes the work of grace in our lives. So the way that I like to think about this is, and I've talked to people about who say, well, I'm not really like a sinner because, I don't do anything too bad, I've never blown anything up, never murdered anybody, never stole more than $10,000 at any one time. Hey, I'm not that bad. I always want to say, well, that's not the standard. The standard is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Falling below that standard indicates that you and we are sinners, right? That's the idea. And that's precisely why God has to work grace in our lives to turn our hearts around. One final thing, and this is where I'm going to have to stop, because we've got, apparently we do like another worship service at 11:15, I think. Moses here talks also about walking in God's ways. I'm going to say some more about that next Sunday. But I want you to, if you would, kind of in preparation for this, read the 4th chapter of Ephesians, because Paul's going to bring this language back about walking in the ways of the Lord. He'll even make it more specific. He'll talk about walking in a way that does justice to the calling that you've been called. So I want to say a few things about walking, because this is like a really important concept, both here in Deuteronomy and then later on in the New Testament. And then we'll also see, we'll get into Deuteronomy 31 at last, and we'll see something that's really important. We'll see that God tells Moses that every 5 years, the whole of the law is to be read to the gathered people of Israel, kind of as a way of reminding them what they're supposed to be doing. So here's a way to think about this. You may remember that every time someone's baptized, back there at that baptismal font, right, we reaffirm our own baptismal vows. And one of the ways we do that, right, is we all affirm together what's called the Apostles' Creed. That's a similar thing, right? We're reminding ourselves of what it is that we're about and who we are. So we're gonna see that the law is going to get read in the hearing of all the people of Israel every 5 years. There's some other things going to be happening, but once again, that's to kind of remind people, okay, here's who we are, and here's what we're doing. Let's not forget it. Or as one church leader once said, church leadership is really simple. You only need to do one thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing.